I spent 10 years learning how to disappear. I changed my name. I buried my accent. I trained my hands not to shake and my mouth not to open when I heard the old language, the one my father whispered to me in the dark while we ran, the one my mother was still screaming in when they dragged her away. 10 years of silence. 10 years of being no one. And then one night, in a restaurant I had no business working in, a king spoke in the tongue of the dead, and my body answered before my mind could stop it. One sentence. That's all it took. And every locked door inside me blew open at once. If you've ever held something inside so long it became your bones, if you know what it costs to finally let it out, stay close. This one is yours. The crash of a bread plate hitting marble sounded like a bone breaking. At Rossetti's, the kind of Chicago restaurant where a reservation required a bloodline or a bribe, dropping anything was a firing offense. But tonight, it might as well have been a death sentence. Because the plate hadn't shattered near just anyone's table. It had shattered at the feet of the man sitting at table 9. I knew who he was before I looked. Everyone did. Not because they'd read about him. You didn't read about Rasputin Romulo. You felt him. The way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. The way a room full of powerful people goes suddenly, obediently still. He didn't look like what the stories promised. No cape. No shadow beneath the collar. He wore an ivory suit so precise it looked sculpted onto him, a crimson cravat folded at his throat like a wound pressed closed. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have hung in a gallery. Beautiful, yes, but in the way a cathedral is beautiful. Cold stone. Perfect angles. Something built to outlast you. His entourage, 4 men in deep crimson suits with gold thread at the cuffs, flanked him like columns of a temple. They didn't fidget. They didn't blink often enough. And their eyes, when they moved too smoothly, too precisely, like predators tracking a scent that hadn't arrived yet. The boy who had dropped the plate was Jeremiah. 17, new hire, hands still shaking from the interview. He stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces on the floor like they were his own future in shards. And Rasputin looked at him. Not with anger. That would have been human. This was worse. This was the patient, unblinking regard of something that had watched civilizations crumble and found it unremarkable. His fingers stopped turning the page of the leather-bound ledger he'd been reading. He leaned forward just slightly and spoke. The words were low, quiet, and older than the building we stood in. It was Sicilian, but not the Sicilian of textbooks or tourist phrases. This was the dialect of the Western Hills, the tongue of the mortal families who had served the old courts for centuries before the covenants were broken. A language that had no living speakers. A language that should have been ash. Sprazzativai di questa creatura tremanti prima che gli opera la gola io stesso. Throw this trembling creature out before I open his throat myself. No one moved. The manager, Mr. Whitmore, a man who pronounced his name, Monsieur Blancmort, and believed his own lie, rushed forward, wringing his hands. Sir, is everything satisfactory? Can I? Rasputin ignored him entirely. His gaze stayed locked on Jeremiah. His hand drifted, slowly, toward the steak knife resting on white linen. And I could see it, not the threat of violence, but the absolute certainty of it. This was not a man who bluffed. My body moved before my mind gave permission. I stepped forward, lifted the water pitcher, and filled his glass with a hand I forced to be steady. And then I opened my mouth and ruined my life. Non è inutile, signore. Ha solo pora. La pora fa tremer le mani, ma non è il cor. He is not useless, my lord. He is only afraid. Fear shakes the hands, but not the heart. The silence that followed was a living thing. It pressed against the walls. It swallowed the ambient music, the kitchen noise, the low hum of wealth pretending to be casual. Everything stopped. Rasputin's hand froze an inch from the knife. His head turned, slowly, deliberately, and for the first time all evening, his gaze left its prey and found me. I was nothing to look at. A waitress in a navy vest a size too large, hair braided back tight because I couldn't afford to be noticed. No jewelry. No makeup. The kind of woman designed to disappear between the tables. And I had just spoken to the most dangerous creature in Chicago in the language of his grandmother's grave. His eyes were the color of old amber, holding something trapped inside, and when they fixed on mine, I felt it, the weight of centuries pressing against my ribs, reading me the way you read a page you've been searching for. "What did you say?" he asked. "English now." His voice barely a whisper, which somehow made it louder. I swallowed. My throat was sand. But I held his gaze because my father had taught me one thing above all others. If you look away from something ancient, it decides you are food. I said, "He's just afraid, sir." He studied me. Not the way men usually studied me, not my body, not my face. He studied me the way you study a locked door that just spoke your name. "You speak the old tongue." It was not a question. "Where did you learn it?" "My grandmother." I lied. My face pleasant. My pulse a war drum. "She was from Palermo." She cursed a lot. A flicker at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. A measurement. "Sit down," he said. "Sir, I'm on shift." "Sit down." The authority in his voice moved through me like a hand pressing on my chest. The men in crimson didn't shift, but their stillness sharpened. Mr. Whitmore gasped somewhere behind me. I set the pitcher down. I smoothed my apron. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat because the alternative was running, and I had learned a long time ago that running from something this old only tells it which direction to chase. He closed the leather ledger. He folded his hands. His eyes never left mine. "Who are you?" "Alyssa," I said. "Just Alyssa." "Just Alyssa," he repeated softly. "From Palermo. Who speaks a dialect that hasn't been spoken by a living soul in 40 years. He tilted his head, and in the firelight from the table's candle, his pupils did something human eyes don't do. They contracted into slits, just for a second, and then smoothed back. "Tell me, just Alyssa," he whispered, leaning forward until I could smell centuries on him. Old wine, cathedral stone, and something underneath that was purely, terrifyingly alive. Why does a waitress in Chicago carry the language of the dead on her tongue? And why is her heart beating as though she already knows the answer will cost her everything? I didn't answer, because he was right, and the cost had already begun. I didn't finish my shift. Mr. Whitmore pulled me into the kitchen before Rasputin's entourage had even cleared the front doors. His face was the color of old cheese, and his hands were shaking worse than Jeremiah's had been. He told me to take the week off. He told me he'd mail my check. He told me, without quite saying it, that I was a disease he needed to cut out before it spread to his restaurant. I didn't argue. I untied my apron, grabbed my jacket from the hook by the service entrance, and walked out into the rain. Chicago in October doesn't rain, it grieves. The sky just opens and pours without apology, soaking through your clothes until the cold reaches your bones and settles there like it owns the place. I walked fast, head down, sneakers slapping through puddles on Wabash. I didn't check my reflection in shop windows to fix my hair. I checked it to see if I was being followed. I wasn't ready for Godfrey. He didn't step out of a car. He stepped out of nothing, a shadow that peeled itself off the wall of a parking garage and solidified into 6.5 feet of something that used to be a man. Broad shoulders, shaved head, a face that looked like it had been carved from mahogany by someone who didn't believe in softness. He wore a crimson suit like the others, but on him it looked like a warning label. "Get in," he said. His voice was the low rumble of a furnace in a basement. You felt it in your chest before your ears processed the words. A black SUV idled at the curb behind him. I hadn't heard it pull up. "I'll walk," I said, not stopping. "That wasn't a choice, miss." 2 doors opened ahead of me. 2 more men in crimson, standing on the sidewalk with their feet apart and their hands clasped. Not touching weapons. Not needing to. Their stillness was the weapon. I stopped. The rain ran down my face, and I let it, because if I wiped my eyes, they'd see my hands shaking. I thought about the pepper spray on my keychain. I thought about screaming. I thought about how empty the street was at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday, and how a scream in this part of the city would just be another sound the lake swallowed. My father's voice in my head, the way it always was when the world closed in. Think. Don't feel. Feeling gets you killed.
Think.
Am I being arrested?
I asked.
Godfrey almost smiled. Almost. You're being invited. The king would like to continue your conversation. At 1 in the morning. He keeps unusual hours. I looked at the SUV. I looked at the empty street behind me. Cooperation bought time. Resistance bought bruises. I'd learned that arithmetic young.
Fine, I said.
But I have a cat at home, and if he doesn't get fed by 3, he becomes unbearable. I didn't have a cat. But lies were currency, and I spent them like a woman who knew the account was almost empty. The leather seat was soft. The door lock was not. It engaged with a sound I recognized from somewhere deeper than memory, the heavy, mechanical finality of a cage closing. I watched Chicago blur past the tinted windows and tried to memorize the route, but we weren't heading to a warehouse or a dock or any of the dark places I'd braced myself for. We were heading north. Lakeshore Drive, past the high-rises and the money until the buildings thinned and the trees thickened, and then through a gate, wrought iron, old, with a crest I recognized from my father's drawings. 2 wolves flanking a crescent moon. The house of Romulo. The estate sat on the shore of Lake Michigan like something the modern world had tried to forget and failed. Old stone walls. Narrow windows that watched the water. Security cameras blinking red among the ivy, a century of power wearing a thin disguise of technology. It wasn't a home. It was a statement. I was here before you, and I will be hereafter. Godfrey opened my door. Library, he said, the way someone else might say gallows. They walked me through a foyer that smelled of beeswax and old wood, past portraits of men with pale eyes and sharp mouths, faces that spanned centuries but shared the same unsettling stillness. I recognized the architecture of dynasty. My father had taught me to read it the way other fathers taught their daughters to read road signs. These are the families, Alicia. Learn their faces. Know their houses. It's the only map that matters. The library doors opened, and the smell hit me first, leather, aged paper, and something faintly metallic beneath it. Old blood, maybe. Or just the memory of it soaked into stone that had seen too much. He was standing by the window. The suit jacket was gone. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and in the low amber light, I could see the corded muscle of his forearms, the unnatural smoothness of skin that had stopped aging when the world still moved by horse and sail. A cross was tattooed on his right wrist. Faded, deliberate, the kind of mark a man gets before he stops being a man entirely. He didn't turn around. You didn't run, he said. Your people are very convincing, I said from the doorway. I didn't step further in. The room felt like a throat, and I didn't want to be swallowed. Godfrey lacks subtlety, Rasputin said. But he's efficient. He turned then, and in the firelight, his face was sharper than it had been in the restaurant. The civility had thinned. What was underneath was older and less patient. Drink. He held out a glass of something dark and amber. His hand was perfectly steady. I don't drink with strangers. We're not strangers, Alyssa. He said my name the way you test a key in a lock, carefully listening for the click. Or should I say, whoever you actually are. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face still. My father's training. My mother's stubbornness. The 2 things that had kept me alive for a decade, braided together so tight I couldn't tell them apart anymore. I told you who I am. You told me a name. He set the glass down and picked up a thin folder from the desk. He opened it without looking at it. He'd already memorized the contents. Alyssa Moretti. Social Security number issued in Ohio 3 years ago. Before that, nothing. No school records. No tax returns. No medical history. No parking tickets. He closed the folder. You appeared out of thin air at the age of 32, fully formed, with a dead-end rental in Bridgeport and a job pouring water for men you could speak circles around. He crossed the room. Not fast, deliberately. Each step closing the distance between us like a tide that doesn't care about your plans. You don't exist, Alyssa. And I have found in 400 years of paying attention that people who don't exist are either running from something or running toward something. He stopped 3 feet from me, close enough that I could smell him. Not cologne, not blood, but something older. Rain on cathedral stone. Wood smoke from a century no one alive remembers. And underneath all of it warmth. Real warmth. The kind that shouldn't belong to something undead, but did. "Which are you?" he asked, his voice dropping low enough to press against my sternum. I looked into his eyes. Amber with something trapped inside. I'd seen eyes like that once before. In the face of the vampire who had come to our house in Milwaukee, the night my mother screamed for the last time. Eyes that weren't cruel. Exactly. Just ancient enough that cruelty and mercy had blurred into the same instrument, used interchangeably, depending on what served the moment. I was afraid.
I want to be honest about that.
Not the sharp, clean fear of a sudden threat, the heavy, bone-deep fear of a woman who has been carrying a secret so long it has fused to her spine, and someone is now pulling at it with steady hands. But I had also learned this. Fear and desire live in the same room. They share a wall so thin that when one speaks, the other hears every word. And standing in that library, with the fire popping and Lake Michigan moaning against the rocks outside, and this impossible, terrifying, beautiful creature studying me like I was the first interesting thing he'd encountered in a century, I felt both. In equal measure. Pulling me in opposite directions with the same force. "I'm the woman who just wants to go home," I said quietly. He tilted his head. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not softness, but recognition. As if he'd heard that sentence before. As if he knew exactly what it cost to say it and mean it. "Wrong answer," he whispered. And he was right. Because home didn't exist anymore. It hadn't for 10 years. I'd just been too afraid to admit that the place I'd been protecting was already gone. The fire cracked. The lake breathed. And Rasputin Romulo watched me the way a man watches a door he hasn't decided whether to open or board shut, knowing that either choice changes everything, and there's no going back to not knowing what's on the other side. I didn't look away. Neither did he. And in the silence between us, something began. Not trust, not yet, and not love. Nothing so simple, but the first thin thread of a thing I hadn't felt in a decade. Being seen. I didn't sleep that night. Rasputin gave me a guest room on the second floor of the estate, the kind of room that costs more than everything I've ever owned combined. Egyptian cotton sheets, a view of the lake through windows that were thick enough to stop bullets, and a lock on the door that I tested 3 times before I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. He hadn't let me leave. He hadn't explained why. He'd simply said, "Godfrey will show you to your room." The way you'd say the weather's turning. Calm, factual, and completely non-negotiable. I sat in the dark and listened to the lake. It sounded like breathing. Slow, heavy, ancient breathing, as if something enormous had settled against the shore and was waiting with the kind of patience only very old things possess. I should have been planning. Mapping exits, counting guards, figuring out which window had the shortest drop to survivable ground. Instead, I sat there and replayed the way he'd looked at me in the library. That tilt of his head, that pause after I'd said I wanted to go home. The recognition in his eyes. Like he understood wanting something that doesn't exist anymore. Like he'd been carrying that same hollowed-out ache for longer than I'd been alive. Stop it, I told myself. He's not a person. He's a predator with good manners. But my hands were still warm where the air between us had been, and that scared me more than anything else in that house. I must have dozed, because when Godfrey's knock came, the sky outside was the color of a bruise, that gray-violet hour before true dawn when Chicago looks like a city painted in sorrow. "The king requires your presence," Godfrey said through the door. Nothing else. No context. No pleas. They drove me south. Past the Loop, past Chinatown, into the industrial gut of the city where the Chicago River bends and the buildings stop pretending to be anything other than what they are, steel and rust and function. The air changed as we got closer. It thickened, turned acrid and wrong, carrying the smell of scorched metal and something chemical, wet ash and melted rubber. I saw the smoke before I saw the fire. Rasputin's dockyard, a sprawling complex of warehouses along the South Branch, was a skeleton. The main structure had collapsed inward, still smoldering, sending thin black ribbons into the morning sky. Fire crews were there, standing back, kept at a distance by men in dark coats who clearly didn't answer to the city. No police. The Romulo family didn't need police. They were the authority here, and everyone on that waterfront knew it. Rasputin stood near the loading dock, his ivory coat replaced by black, long, severe, buttoned to the throat like armor. His face was carved from something harder than it had been last night. The firelight had softened him in the library. Here, in the gray morning light, standing before the ruin of something he'd built, he looked like what he was.
Old.
Furious. Dangerous. He didn't greet me. He pointed. The wall. The main warehouse had crumbled, but the brick retaining wall along the eastern edge had survived. And on it, spray-painted in jagged, dripping crimson, was a message. My knees almost gave out. It wasn't Italian. It wasn't standard Sicilian. It was the layered, cryptic dialect of the old servant families, the mortal bloodlines who had brokered between vampire courts for generations. But it was twisted with something else, a cadence I recognized the way you recognize your mother's handwriting on a letter you weren't supposed to find. It was the dialect of the Chunli court, the specific branch that had operated out of the Western Hills, the same branch that had employed my father, and the same branch that had killed my mother. Lu sangu kayama lu sangu. La procurata e tornata a casa. Blood calls for blood. The little girl has returned home. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and wet, like a fist pounding on a locked door from the inside. They knew. The Chunli knew I was in Chicago. My slip at the restaurant, that single, stupid, irreversible sentence, had rippled outward through whatever network of informants and watchers these ancient families maintained, and it had reached the one clan that had spent 15 years waiting for exactly this signal. The message wasn't for Rasputin. It was for me. A love letter written in blood-red paint, from the people who had butchered my mother in our kitchen while I hid in the basement and pressed my hands over my ears so hard I left bruises on my own skull. Well, Rasputin's voice cut through the static in my head. I blinked. He was watching me, not the wall, me. His men stood in a loose semicircle, shifting uncomfortably. One of them, a lean, dark-eyed vampire named Fenton, had attempted a translation earlier. Something about blood, my lord, Fenton offered weakly. The second part, Procurata, we think it means picture. A small picture? It didn't mean picture. It meant little girl. It was the nickname the Chun-Li had given me when I was 9 years old, and my father would bring me to their court, the quiet child with the braided hair who sat in the corner and listened to everything. La Procurata, their pet name for me, before they decided my father was a thief and our family became prey. Translate it, Rasputin said to me. Not a request. I had about 4 seconds to decide who I was going to be. If I told him the truth, that the message was about me, that I was the daughter of the man who had stolen from one of the oldest vampire dynasties in the world, he would either kill me or use me as bait. Men like Rasputin didn't protect liabilities. They spent them. If I lied, I bought time. Maybe enough time to disappear again. Maybe enough time to find the burner phone I'd left in my apartment and call the one number that could save me. My father's voice, steady and low, the way it always was when he taught me the dangerous lessons. A lie isn't a wall, Alicia. It's a bridge. It only needs to hold long enough for you to cross. It's a threat, I said. My voice came out steady enough. The tremor was inside, buried deep, vibrating against my ribs like a trapped bird. Blood calls for blood. The debts are coming home. Debts, Rasputin repeated. He took a step toward me. Not aggressive, curious. The way a wolf steps closer to something it hasn't categorized yet. Procurata, I continued, wrapping the lie in just enough truth to make it breathe. In the coastal dialects, it refers to small debts. The kind that accumulate. Interest on old grievances. You're sure? My grandmother was very specific about her insults. He studied me. I could feel his gaze moving across my face the way fingers move across braille, reading what was underneath, searching for the bump, the inconsistency, the tell. I kept my expression flat. I kept my breathing even. I kept my hands at my sides. but they were shaking. Just slightly. Just the fingertips. A tremor so small that a human wouldn't have noticed it from 3 feet away. Rasputin was not human. His eyes dropped to my hands. Lingered. Then rose back to my face. He didn't say anything. He didn't challenge me. He didn't press. He simply looked at me for a long, terrible moment, and then turned back to the wall. Fenton. Photograph the message. Run it through the archives. Cross-reference every known associate from the Trapani and Calabrian territories in the last 30 years. Yes, my lord. He turned back to me, and I braced myself for the accusation. For the grab, the snarl, the demand for truth that these creatures were famous for. Instead, he said something worse. You must be cold. Godfrey, take her back to the estate. See that she eats. That was it. No confrontation. No follow-up. Just a quiet, deliberate release of pressure. The way you loosen a tourniquet not because the bleeding has stopped, but because you want to see where the blood flows. He was watching.
He was cataloging.
He had seen my hands shake, and he had filed it away in whatever ancient architecture of suspicion and strategy lived behind those amber eyes. I walked back to the SUV, on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. Godfrey opened the door. I slid in. The leather was warm from the heater. The door locked with that same terrible finality. As the car pulled away, I looked back through the rear window. Rasputin stood before the ruined wall, the crimson letters glowing behind him in the pale morning light. La Picurda è tornata a casa. The little girl has returned home. And in that moment, I understood something my father had tried to tell me the night we fled Milwaukee, the night my mother's screams still hung in the air like smoke. You can change your name, Alicia. You can change your city, your face, your voice. But the blood remembers. It always remembers. And one day, it calls you back. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window and closed my eyes. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The smell found me first. I was sitting in the guest room, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at the lake through the window without seeing it. I'd been doing that for hours, sitting in the kind of stillness that isn't peace but paralysis, the way your body goes quiet when it's run out of ways to move that don't lead somewhere worse. And then it reached me through the crack beneath the door. Garlic. Butter. The warm, round smell of pasta water at a rolling boil. Someone was cooking. I followed it down the hallway and into a kitchen I hadn't seen the night before, industrial-sized but old, with stone counters and copper pots that hung from iron hooks like they'd been there since before electricity. And standing at the stove, sleeves rolled past his forearms, an ivory dish towel draped over one shoulder, was Rasputin Romulo. He was making carbonara. The sight was so dislocating that I stopped in the doorway and just stood there, trying to reconcile the creature who had terrified an entire restaurant into silence with the man currently cracking eggs into a bowl with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. You cook, I said. It came out flat, almost accusatory, because I didn't know what else to do with the information. My mother insisted. He didn't look up. His hands moved with a precision that was older than the recipe, separating yolks, grating pecorino, rendering guanciale until the fat went translucent and the kitchen filled with a smell so deeply, achingly human that something behind my ribs cracked. She told me a man who cannot feed himself is still a child, regardless of how many centuries he's survived. He plated 2 servings and slid one across the island toward me.
Eat.
I'm not hungry. I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said eat. I sat. I picked up the fork. And when I tasted it, the salt, the pepper, the richness of the egg coating each strand of pasta like a whisper, I almost cried. Not because it was good, although it was extraordinary. Because it tasted like my mother's kitchen. Like Saturday mornings in Milwaukee before the world split open. Like the life I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten I was still grieving it. He watched me eat. He wasn't eating. He leaned against the counter with a glass of dark wine, and his eyes traced my face the way candlelight traces a wall, slowly, catching on the edges of things. You lied to me this morning, he said. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. At the dockyard, he continued, his voice soft the way a blade is soft just before it cuts. You translated the words, but you held something back. I could see it. Your hands told me one story. Your mouth told me another. You're imagining things. Am I? Not a question. He set down his glass and walked around the island. I could feel the heat of him behind my chair, not body heat, something else, something that pulsed with a low, ancient frequency, like standing too close to a power line. He leaned down, and his voice was a low current against my ear. I had Fenton run the photograph through my archives, cross-referencing every known dialect variation in the Trapani and Calabrian territories from the last century. A pause. Do you know what pecurita means, Alyssa? My throat closed. It doesn't mean dead. It doesn't mean picture. His hand came to rest on the back of my chair, not touching me, just close enough that I could feel the air between his skin and my shoulder tighten like a held breath. It means little girl. It was a pet name, used specifically within the Chunli court for the daughter of their consigliere, a mortal man named Tommaso Versicii, who served the clan for 23 years before he stole their sacred blood ledgers and vanished. The kitchen went very quiet. Even the lake seemed to stop its breathing. Tommaso had a daughter, Rasputin said, and now his voice had dropped below a whisper into something that vibrated in the space between my vertebrae. Her name was Alicia. She would be about 35 years old now. She would know the old dialect because she grew up inside those walls, listening to conversations she was never meant to understand. His thumb brushed the back of my neck, just once, just barely, and every nerve in my body caught fire. And if she were very smart and very afraid and very good at disappearing, she might end up pouring water in a Chicago restaurant under a name that didn't exist 3 years ago. I couldn't breathe. I should have kept lying. I should have laughed, denied it, spun another story about grandmothers and Palermo and colorful cursing. But my body had reached the place where lies stop working, that exhausted, stripped-down place where you've been carrying something so heavy for so long that when someone finally names it, you don't have the strength to pretend it isn't there. I put my fork down. I pressed my hands flat on the cold stone counter because they were shaking again, and I needed something solid beneath them. What do you want from me? I whispered. And I hated the way my voice broke on the last word, hated the way it sounded like exactly what it was. A woman who had used up every reserve she had and was standing on the empty floor of herself with nothing left to trade. Rasputin moved around the chair. He stood in front of me. He looked at my face, really looked the way you look at something you're deciding whether to save or destroy, and for one suspended, airless moment, I saw something behind those ancient amber eyes that I was not prepared for. Not suspicion. Not calculation.
Pain.
Old pain. The kind that outlives the body that caused it and just keeps living in the blood, passed down through centuries like a family heirloom no one asked for. I want the truth, he said. And I want to know why. Despite the fact that you could bring a war to my doorstep, I cannot make myself let you go. The air between us changed. The suspicion was still there, sharp and real, but underneath it was something far more dangerous, a pull, a gravity, the specific and terrible magnetism of two people who recognize each other's wounds without knowing why. I'd felt it in the library. I'd felt it at the dockyard when he chose not to press me. And I felt it now, standing in his kitchen with the taste of his carbonara still on my tongue and the ruins of my last lie scattered between us like broken glass. I opened my mouth. The window exploded inward. Glass and lake water and something concussive, a blast that picked me up off the stool and threw me against the far wall. My head hit stone. The world went white, then red, then a ringing silence that swallowed everything. I heard gunfire before I heard my own screaming. Automatic weapons, the sharp, rapid chatter of them, coming from the east side of the estate. From the water. They were coming from the water. Rasputin moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment he was standing in front of me. The next he had me behind him, pressed against the wall, his body a shield between mine and the shattered window. His hand was on my head, pushing me down. His other hand held a weapon I hadn't seen him draw, sleek, black, pulled from somewhere inside his shirt. "Stay behind me," he said, and his voice was different now. The softness was gone. The curiosity was gone. What was left was 400 years of war compressed into a single, cold command. Another explosion. Closer. The floor shook. Plaster rained from the ceiling. I could hear boots. Heavy, fast, coordinated, hitting the stone floors of the East Wing. And beneath the gunfire and the shouting, I heard something else. A voice, amplified through a megaphone, calling out across the water in a dialect I knew like my own heartbeat. Picurita. Tornada a casa. Little girl.
Come home.
They were here. The Chun-Li had found me. Not in a week. Not in a month. Tonight.
Now.
While the taste of eggs and pecorino was still dissolving on my tongue, and the words "I cannot make myself let you go" were still hanging in the air between us like smoke that hadn't decided where to settle. Rasputin grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the kitchen. His grip was iron wrapped in something almost gentle, holding me like I was both a weapon and something breakable, and he hadn't decided which mattered more.
The tunnels, he said.
Move. And I moved. Not because I trusted him, not because I believed he could save me, but because in that moment, crouched in the wreckage of his kitchen with glass in my hair and blood on my lip and the ghosts of my childhood howling through the broken windows, he was the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart at every seam.
We ran.
And behind us, the estate burned. The tunnels beneath the estate were older than the house above them, older than Chicago. Stone walls slick with groundwater, carved by hands that had been dust for centuries, and the air was dense, wet earth and iron, and the faint mineral tang of the lake pressing in from all sides like a living thing trying to reclaim what had been hollowed from its body. Rasputin ran ahead of me, one hand gripping mine, the other pressed against the tunnel wall for balance. Even in the dark, and it was dark, the kind of black that doesn't thin when your eyes adjust, he moved with certainty. He could see what I couldn't. He was built for places like this. Behind us, the estate groaned. I could feel the concussions through the stone, deep, structural thuds that traveled through the floor and up through my knees. They were breaching the main house, taking it apart room by room, looking for me. We reached a junction where the tunnel split into three. Rasputin stopped, listening. His head tilted at that angle I was beginning to recognize, the predator's pause, filtering sounds too subtle for my ears. Then something happened that I hadn't expected. He pushed me behind him just as a shadow detached itself from the left tunnel. Fast, inhumanly fast, a blade catching what little light there was. I didn't see the strike. I heard it, a wet, tearing sound, like fabric ripping over something denser. And Rasputin made a noise I will never forget as long as I live. Not a scream, not a grunt, but a hiss drawn through clenched teeth that carried 400 years of refusing to show pain and almost failing. He killed the attacker with one motion. I didn't see that either. I just heard the body drop. Then he swayed. Vincent Rasputin. I grabbed his arm. My hand came away warm and wet. In the dark, I couldn't see the color, but I could smell it. His blood didn't smell like mine. It smelled like copper and burnt sugar, and something electric, like the air before lightning. Silver, he said through his teeth. Bless silver. The Chun-Li always did have a fondness for religious irony. How bad? I'll survive. He straightened, but I could feel the tremor in his arm. Vampires don't tremble. Whatever that blade had been coated with, it was working against him in ways his body wasn't equipped to simply overrule. We need to move. Where do we go? The question landed on me with the weight of everything it implied. He was asking me. The king of the Midwest, wounded and bleeding in his own tunnel, was asking a waitress where to hide. And God help me, I knew the answer. Pilsen, I said. I know a place. We emerged through a drainage grate on the west side, 2 blocks from the Stevenson Expressway. The rain had started again, that same grieving Chicago rain, relentless and cold. It washed the tunnel grime from our clothes but did nothing for the wound. Rasputin's left side was soaked dark. He was holding himself together with will alone, and I could see the cost of it in the rigid line of his jaw, the way his breathing had gone shallow and deliberate, each breath a negotiation with a body that wanted to collapse. I hailed a cab. No apps. Cash only. I gave the driver an address on 18th Street and pressed a wad of damn tip money into his hand, bills I'd been keeping in the lining of my jacket for 3 years because my father had taught me to always have running money where no one thinks to look. The apartment was above a laundromat called Lavanderia Sol, a place that had been closed for 2 years but still smelled of industrial detergent and fabric softener. My father had rented it under a name that didn't exist, paid in cash for a decade, and told me to never use it unless the world ended. The door stuck. The lock was rusted. Inside, it was exactly as he'd left it, a pull-out couch with a faded quilt, a first aid kit under the bathroom sink, canned food in the cupboard with expiration dates that had come and gone. Dust on every surface like a layer of grief that had settled while no one was looking. I pushed Rasputin onto the couch. He sat heavily, and for the first time, he looked something less than immortal. He looked like a man in pain who was very, very tired of not admitting it. "Shirt off," I said. "You could at least offer me dinner first." His voice was thin, a joke hanging on by its fingernails. I didn't laugh. I couldn't. My hands were already moving, peeling the ruined fabric from his skin, exposing the wound. The blade had carved a channel through the muscle below his ribs. On a human, it would have been fatal. On him, it was a slowly closing mouth that kept reopening, the blessed silver preventing the regeneration his body was desperately trying to perform. I found the first aid kit. Alcohol. Gauze. A needle and thread from a sewing tin my father had kept because he was a man who believed in fixing things with his hands. I cleaned the wound. Rasputin didn't flinch. He just watched me. His eyes were feverish. Not with infection. Vampires don't get infections, but with something raw. The silver was thinning whatever walls he normally kept between himself and the world, and what was leaking through was unguarded in a way that frightened me more than the wound. "Your hands are steady," he murmured. "I've done this before." I threaded the needle. My voice was calm. My insides were not. My father taught me when I was 12. I fell off my bike and needed stitches. He didn't trust hospitals because hospitals ask questions and questions leave trails. "Your father taught you many things. He knew this day would come." I began to stitch. Small, even pulls. The way I'd been taught. The way my mother used to hem my school skirts. That same measured patience applied to a wound on a vampire king's body in a dead man's apartment above a laundromat in Pilsen. The absurdity of it sat in my chest like a stone. "Alyssa." I didn't look up. I couldn't, because his voice had changed, stripped of authority, stripped of control, stripped of everything except the raw, exposed nerve of a man confronting something he couldn't outrun or outfight. "You got out," he said quietly. "You were safe. You had a life. A name. A job that bored you, and an apartment that was too small, and a routine that kept you invisible." His hand came up, slowly, trembling slightly from the silver's poison, and his fingers found my wrist. Not gripping, resting, like he needed to touch something real. "And I pulled you back. Into this. Into blood and fire, and the exact life you spent 15 years escaping." I stopped stitching. I looked at him, and I told him the truth. Not because I decided to, because I was too tired to hold the lie anymore. It had been sitting on my chest for 15 years, and in that dusty apartment with his blood on my hands and the sound of rain on the windows and the specific, terrible intimacy of stitching closed a wound on someone who was never supposed to matter to me, I just couldn't carry it one more second. "I was never safe," I whispered. "I was never out. I was just tired, Rasputin. I was so tired of being afraid that I mistook exhaustion for peace. I called it a life because I didn't know what else to call the thing you build when you've stopped believing you deserve anything real." My voice cracked. I didn't fix it. I let it break open the way you let a dam break, when the water's already spilling over the top and holding it back is just prolonging the flood. Every morning, I checked the locks. Every night, I slept with my shoes on. I kept a bag packed under the bed and cash in my bra, and I never let anyone close enough to notice that I flinched when someone stood behind me in line at the grocery store. Tears. Hot, sudden, the kind that come when something 15 years old finally surfaces and demands to be felt. That's not safety. That's a prison with a better view. His hand tightened around my wrist. Not pulling. Anchoring. I should not have brought you into this, he said, and there was something in his voice I had never heard from a creature like him. Regret so genuine it sounded like a wound of its own. You didn't bring me in, I said. I walked in. I opened my mouth in that restaurant because a boy was about to get hurt, and I have never been able to just stand there and watch someone suffer when I have the power to stop it. That's not your fault. That's my flaw. That's always been my flaw. He was quiet for a long time. The rain filled the silence. Somewhere below, the laundromat's pipes groaned in their sleep. Then he pulled me toward him. Not hard. Not fast. Just a steady, deliberate pressure on my wrist that closed the distance between us until I was kneeling between his knees with his blood on my shirt and his breath on my mouth and the entire crumbling architecture of my carefully constructed loneliness shaking on its foundations. Your flaw, he said, his lips an inch from mine, is the only reason I am alive right now. He kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had lived 400 years without finding the thing he was pressing his mouth against, desperate, shaking, tasting of his own blood and rain and the specific electricity of two people who know they might not survive the week and have decided, in the quiet wreckage of a night that took everything, that this one thing, this one impossible, ill-advised, catastrophically timed thing, is worth reaching for anyway. I kissed him back. I kissed him back with 15 years of silence dissolving on my tongue. With the locked doors and the packed bags and the shoes I slept in and the grocery store flinches and the decade of calling exhaustion a life. I kissed him with every lie I'd ever told to survive, and in that moment, the lies stopped working because my body had chosen a different kind of truth, the kind that doesn't protect you, the kind that splits you open and lets the light in through the crack. When we broke apart, I was crying. Not sobbing, just tears, quiet and steady, running down my face the way the rain ran down the windows. He pressed his forehead against mine. His skin was cooler than a human's but warmer than I expected, and I could feel his pulse, slow, ancient, but there. Tomorrow, he whispered. We find who betrayed us. We end this. Tomorrow, I agreed. He lay back on the narrow couch, and I curled up beside him with my head on his chest and his arm drawn across me like a wall between my body and the world. His heartbeat was slow and steady, one beat for every 3 of mine, and I matched my breathing to it the way you match your steps to someone walking beside you when you've been walking alone for so long you've forgotten what it feels like to move in rhythm with another person. For the first time in 15 years, I did not check the lock on the door. For the first time in 15 years, I slept like someone who believed, even for a few hours, that she might be worth protecting. Morning light came through the grimy windows of the Pilsen apartment like an apology, thin, gray, not quite committed. I woke alone on the couch, and for one terrible second, the old panic surged, the instinct to reach for the bag under the bed, to check the exits, to run. Then I smelled coffee. Terrible, instant, beautiful coffee. Rasputin stood by the window, peering through the blinds with the phone pressed to his ear. He'd found a shirt in the old dresser, a faded Cubs T2 sizes too small, stretching across his chest in a way that would have been absurd if his face hadn't looked like it was carved from the same stone as the gravestones we'd be standing in before the day was done. He hung up. He didn't turn around. Bernice, he said. One word. But the way he said it, the way the syllables came out ground flat, stripped of everything except a betrayal so deep it had gone past anger into something colder, told me everything. She sold the security codes to the Chun-Li, he continued. My analysts confirmed it an hour ago. The breach pattern matches her access level exactly. No one else had the island's override sequences. A pause. His fingers tightened on the phone until the plastic creaked. And Fenton is dead. They found him in the drainage canal off Ashland. Throat opened. Bernice facilitated it to cover her tracks. Fenton, the lean, dark-eyed vampire who'd tried to translate the dockyard message, who had stood in the cold morning air and offered his best guess because he wanted to be useful.
Dead now.
Because someone Rasputin trusted for decades had decided that loyalty was a currency she could trade for something better. How long? I asked. How long was she working against you? Long enough. He finally turned. His face was controlled, but his eyes weren't. Behind the amber, something was burning. Not rage exactly, but the particular devastation of a man realizing that the hand he'd relied on to guard his back had been holding a knife the entire time. Bernice has been with me for 67 years. She managed my household. She knew my schedules, my safe houses, my vulnerabilities. She knew everything. I recognized the look on his face. I'd seen it in my own mirror for 15 years. The look of someone re-examining every memory, every conversation, every moment of trust, and watching them all curdle. What do we do? I asked.
He looked at me.
And what he asked next, he asked quietly, without command, without authority, just one wounded creature asking another. I need you to do something dangerous, Alyssa. And I need you to choose it. I won't order you. I stood up. I tightened the sash of the borrowed flannel shirt I'd slept in. Something cold and clear was settling in my stomach. Not courage, not quite. Resolve. The specific, hard-edged calm of a woman who has finally run out of room to retreat and discovers that the ground she's standing on is solid enough to fight from.
Tell me.
The back of the yard's container yard was a cathedral of rust. Stacked shipping containers in faded blues and reds, towering 3 high, creating narrow canyons that smelled of diesel and wet metal. The afternoon sky hung low and white above them, pressing the humidity down like a lid. I walked down the center aisle with my hands raised. Jeans from the safe house. The Cubs shirt. No weapon visible. I looked exactly like what I was supposed to look like, small, vulnerable, alone. That's far enough. Bernice's voice echoed off the metal walls before I saw her. She stepped from behind a container, tall, angular, dark hair cropped close to her skull. She had the kind of face that was beautiful the way architecture is beautiful, all precision and no warmth. 6 men flanked her. Not Rasputin soldiers. Chun-Li mercenaries. I could tell by the way they stood, feet apart, hands empty but ready, with the unnatural stillness of the turned. Where is he? Bernice called, her gun trained on my chest. Bleeding out in a motel on Western Avenue. I lied. He sent me to ask you why. Bernice laughed. It was a brittle sound like glass being stepped on.
Why?
Because your king is a relic, girl. He held territory through reputation and fear, but fear has a shelf life. Shangshi Chun-Li offered me something Rasputin never could, a seat at the new table. The old covenants are dead. Power belongs to whoever's willing to take it. And Fenton? I asked, my voice steady. Was he willing? Her smile didn't waver. Fenton was collateral. The word hit me like a slap. Collateral. A man's life, 60 years of loyalty, reduced to an acceptable loss in someone else's ambition. I thought of my mother. Collateral. I thought of every person the old families had consumed in their wars, and how the word was always the same. Collateral. As if human lives were just math that powerful people did in the margins. Your father understood, Bernice said, and her voice dropped into something almost tender, the cruelest possible register. In the end. My breath stopped. Oh, you didn't know? She tilted her head. Tommaso Versicii didn't make it to safety, Alyssa. The Chun-Li caught him in Indiana. 11 years ago. He held out for a long time, I'll give him that. But everyone breaks. And when he broke, he gave them the one thing they wanted. She paused, letting the silence do its work.
You.
Your location. Your new name. Everything. Your daddy sold you to buy a quicker death. The container yard tilted. The sky swung sideways. I heard a sound, a low, animal keen, and realized it was coming for me. 15 years. 15 years of hiding, of sleeping in my shoes, of checking locks and packing bags and telling myself it mattered because somewhere out there my father was alive and I was protecting him by staying invisible. Every sacrifice. Every lonely night. Every name I swallowed, and every person I pushed away. all of it built on the bones of a man who had been dead for over a decade. I had been a ghost haunting a grave I didn't know existed. Bernice raised her gun. Shangxi is on his way to finish this personally. But I think I'll save him the trouble with you. Now, I said. From the top of the container stack, Rasputin descended like something biblical. Not jumping but dropping with a controlled, terrible grace, a sniper rifle in his hands that he'd pulled from a hidden cache my father had built into the safe house's walls. The first shot took the mercenary on Bernice's right. The second took the one on her left. The yard exploded into chaos. I didn't run. I dropped behind a trailer chassis, and when I came up on the other side, the gun Rasputin had given me that morning was already in my hands. Bernice wasn't looking up.
She was looking for me.
I found her first. She spun when she heard my footsteps. Her gun leveled at my chest. But she hesitated 1 second, maybe less, because she expected the waitress. The hiding girl. The procurita who ran. I wasn't her anymore. I fired. The shot echoed off the containers like a church bell. Bernice stiffened. Looked down at the bloom of dark spreading across her chest. Looked back at me with something almost like respect. The waitress, she breathed.
She fell.
I stood over her body, and I felt nothing like what I expected. Not triumph. Not relief. Just a hollow, ringing clarity. The sound a bell makes after it's been struck and the note has faded, and what's left is the silence that was always underneath. Then the limousine arrived. Shangxi Chun Li was ancient in a way that made Rasputin look young. He emerged slowly, leaning on a cane carved from bone, his face a map of centuries folded into papery skin. 10 soldiers with automatic weapons fanned out behind him. "Give me the girl," Shangxi said. His voice carried the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. "Give me the daughter of the thief, and I will let you keep your city, Rasputin. A fair trade. Blood for territory." Rasputin stood in front of me. Wounded, bleeding through the cub's shirt, outnumbered 10-2.
He reached for my hand.
"Do you trust me?" he whispered. I looked at the soldiers. At the impossible odds. At the ancient creature who had spent 15 years hunting my family for a crime my father had already paid for with his life. "Yes," I said. Rasputin smiled, a real smile, wolfish and full of something I can only describe as joy at the approach of violence, and pressed a detonator he'd taken from the safe house. The container behind Shangxi didn't explode. It opened, and what was inside had been waiting there for decades, a contingency built by a king who understood that thrones are defended not by strength, but by preparation. I won't describe what followed. Some things don't need language. They need silence. When it was over, Shangxi Chun Li lay broken against the wreckage of his limousine. The cane snapped. The dynasty ended. Not with ceremony, not with grandeur, just a very old monster dying in the mud of a Chicago rail yard while the sky pressed down gray and indifferent above him. Rasputin took my hand. His was warm with blood, his own and others. Mine was steady. We walked away. 13 months later, I walked through the doors of Rossetti's. The restaurant had been rebuilt. The stuffy pretension stripped away, replaced by something darker, warmer, more honest. I moved through the dining room in an emerald gown that fit like it had been sewn onto my skin, and I carried nothing, no tray, no pitcher, no apron. I carried authority. I carried my own name. The city's powerful were there. They nodded as I passed.
They knew who I was now.
Not Alyssa from Bridgeport. Not Sophie from Ohio. Alicia Versicii. The woman who walked through the kingdom of the undead and came out the other side holding the king's hand and her own identity in equal measure. I reached the private table. Table 9. Rasputin was waiting. The ivory suit was back. The amber eyes softened the moment they found mine, the way they always did now, the way I'd stopped pretending I didn't need them to. He poured 2 glasses of wine. Dark, old, the color of garnets. "Receipts are up 60%. I said, sitting. "And the kitchen staff is terrified of me." "Good. Fear keeps the risotto sharp." He leaned forward, taking my hand across the white tablecloth. His thumb traced the inside of my wrist, the place where my pulse ran close to the surface, the place where he'd first pressed his lips in the dark of the Pilsen apartment and whispered that my heartbeat was the only music he hadn't grown tired of in 4 centuries. Ora, mia regina, he murmured. Il mondo è nostro. Now, my queen. The world is ours. I smiled. I raised my glass. And I spoke clearly, not whispering, not hiding, not modulating my voice to be smaller or quieter or less, letting the nearby tables hear, letting the whole room know exactly who was sitting at this table and exactly what language she chose to speak. Si, Rasputin. Ma ricordati chi comanda in cucina. Yes, Rasputin. But remember who is boss in the kitchen. He threw his head back and laughed, a real, full, living sound that the walls of Rossetti's had never heard before and would never forget. And for a moment, just a moment, he didn't look like a king or a creature or a monster. He looked like a man who had finally found the thing he'd stopped believing existed. And I looked like a woman who had stopped hiding from hers. There are other women in this city. Women who buried their real names like seeds in frozen ground and waited for a spring they weren't sure would come. Women who loved something ancient and dangerous and chose, not fell, chose to stay. We don't talk about it, but we recognize each other. By the way we watch the door. By the way we don't flinch anymore. By the quiet, steady way we hold our own ground in rooms that weren't built for us. If this story found you, if something in it opened a door you thought you'd sealed shut, there are others. They're here, waiting, the way this one waited for you. But stories like these don't chase you. They're quiet. They sit in the dark and breathe until someone comes looking. Subscribe so you don't lose this place. So the next time a story calls your name in a language you thought you'd forgotten, you know exactly where to find it. The Vampire King spoke in Italian. And once again, the waitress had the last word.